Hey there! Tonight we set sail on a mystery so ancient, so bewildering, that historians still argue about it under their breath in dimly lit library corners. It's a tale of collapse, one that shattered empires, silenced languages, and sent entire civilizations into darkness. But before we dive in, do me a favor. If you like voyages into lost history, strange ruins, and forgotten people, hit that like button and subscribe. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Maybe light a candle or turn the lights low. Put on some ambient sea sounds in the background. You're about to drift into a story that's 3,000 years old, and it begins not with kings or gods, but with fire and ruin. Somewhere around 1200 BCE, the world ended. Okay, maybe not the world, but for the Bronze Age, it might as well have been the apocalypse. Cities burned, palaces crumbled, writing systems vanished, trade networks collapsed like a house of cards in a thunderstorm. Empires that had stood for centuries, poof, gone, often within a single human lifetime. And at the smoky heart of this chaos, a name that echoes like a question across millennia: the Sea Peoples. Yeah, that's what we call them, because in true Bronze Age fashion, nobody bothered to write down their actual names. Or maybe they did, and those tablets are now buried under 3 layers of archaeological heartbreak. All we know is this: around the 12th century BCE, a mysterious confederation of naval raiders surged out of the Mediterranean like a tidal wave of destruction. They showed up out of nowhere, burned everything in sight, and then, just as mysteriously, disappeared. Historians didn't invent the term Sea Peoples to sound dramatic. That credit goes to the ancient Egyptians, who, to their eternal credit, not only survived the onslaught, but left behind carved murals and breathless inscriptions that still bear witness to what they endured. Pharaoh Ramses III even put it in stone: a battle against enemies coming from the sea. They came not in trickles, but in fleets, longboats filled with warriors, families, ox carts, and dreams of starting over, or burning everything down. Possibly both. They weren't just pirates. They were something else. A desperate wave of migration? A coordinated war machine? Refugees turned invaders? Nobody's really sure. But they swept across the known world like wildfire on the wind. Imagine waking up in the Bronze Age in a city like Ugarit. You've got clay tablets, bustling markets, olive oil merchants arguing over copper ingots. Things are good. And then, suddenly the sky glows red. Foreign ships beach themselves like beasts, and strange warriors pour out, armed with curved swords and no interest in negotiation. That was the Bronze Age collapse. And the Sea Peoples weren't the only reason it happened, but they were the ones who kicked in the doors. Now, before we follow their trail of devastation, let's take a quick step back and look at the world they were about to unmake. The Eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age, it was booming. You had a web of civilizations humming along in delicate harmony. Egypt was still strutting its pharaonic stuff. The Hittite Empire ruled Anatolia with chariots and treaties. Mycenaean Greece was doing its Trojan War thing. The Canaanites had city-states dotting the Levant like jewels. Everyone traded with everyone. Tin from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, papyrus from the Nile, wine from Cyprus. You could send a letter from Ugarit to Hattusa, the Hittite capital, and expect a reply within weeks, assuming your messenger didn't get eaten by lions. It was globalism Bronze Age edition. But here's the thing about complex systems. When one domino falls, the rest don't just stand there. They wobble, then tumble. And around 1200 BCE, that tumble began. The signs started subtly. Letters between kings started getting nervous. Crops failed. Earthquakes rattled cities. Trade began to falter. And then came the burning. Cities weren't just sacked, they were erased. Knossos, gone. Mycenae, collapsed. Troy, torched. Hattusa, vanished. Ugarit, buried in ash so suddenly that the last letters were still drying in the palace when it burned. One tablet, never sent, begged for help from a neighboring city. "The enemy is at the gates. We are alone. Save us." They weren't saved. And here's where the Sea Peoples make their dramatic entrance. They weren't a single tribe. They were a coalition of peoples. 9 distinct groups are named in Egyptian records, like the Peliset, the Denyen, the Shekelesh, the Checker. Where did they come from? Possibly everywhere. Scholars have linked them to displaced Mycenaeans, Sardinians, Sicilians, Cretans, Cypriots. Some even think they were ancestors of the Philistines, the Bible's perennial troublemakers. But wherever they came from, they arrived with one thing in common: fire. They weren't just raiding villages, they were toppling empires, and they were efficient. By the time they reached Egypt, they had already carved a bloody path across the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant. And then they did something extraordinary. They attacked Egypt itself. Now, ancient Egypt had been around for over 1,000 years by then. Pharaohs didn't scare easily, but Ramses III took this threat seriously. His inscriptions, etched into the walls of Medinet Habu, read like a Bronze Age blockbuster. He describes fleets arriving by sea and columns of warriors advancing by land. Families in ox-drawn carts followed behind, suggesting this wasn't just war, it was migration with a side of conquest. But Ramses was ready. He fortified the Nile Delta. He waited until the Sea Peoples tried to land, and then he unleashed the full fury of Egyptian war tactics, trapping their ships, raining arrows, cutting them down in the shallows. Egypt won that day. The Sea Peoples were repelled, at least according to Egyptian records. And when the people writing the history are the ones with the chisel, you can expect a bit of self-flattery. Still, Egypt survived, just barely. But nearly everyone else did not. The Sea Peoples were like a hammer smashing a fragile web of interconnected cultures. After them came famine, plague, migration, and decades of darkness. Writing systems vanished. Monumental buildings stopped. Trade shriveled. The great palace economies of the Bronze Age were swept away. It would take centuries for anything like that complexity to return. And the Sea Peoples? They vanished into the chaos they helped create.
Imagine standing on the shore after the storm has passed. The boats are gone. The fires have smoldered to ash. The bodies, some armored, some barefoot, lie twisted in sand and soot. Your city isn't just broken, it's silent. The scribes are dead. The palace has no roof. The storehouses are empty, and the grain is soaked in seawater and blood. Welcome to the aftermath of a Sea Peoples raid. We still don't know exactly where they went after Egypt. Some may have settled in the Levant. Others were likely absorbed into the chaos they'd helped ignite. They might have married into local tribes, built new homes, or simply disappeared into history, leaving nothing behind but broken stone and whispered names on crumbling tablets. And those names? Well, they don't help much. Take the Peliset. Many scholars link them to the Philistines, the same folks who'd later spar with the Israelites in the biblical texts. Goliath and his big shoes? Possibly Peliset. The Denyen? Some say they were the Danaans, a name Homer gives the Greeks. The Shekelesh? Maybe Sicilians. Tecker? Possibly Aegean pirates turned settlers in coastal Canaan. But every time we think we've pinned them down, the trail fades again. That's the thing about the Sea Peoples. They are the ghosts in the machine. We have murals of their battles. We have funerary inscriptions boasting of their defeat. We even have letters warning of their approach. But we have no chronicles from them, no monuments by them, no city ruins that scream, "Sea peoples lived here." It's like trying to solve a murder when the killer left no fingerprints, no motive, and no name. Just a trail of corpses and a smirk carved into the wall. And historians? Well, they've been chasing that smirk for over a century. Theories abound. Some say the Sea Peoples were refugees, driven out of their homelands by famine, earthquakes, or collapsing economies. Maybe their crops failed. Maybe their kings fell. Maybe they just got tired of waiting for the storm and decided to become the storm. Others argue they were pirates, plain and simple. Bands of raiders taking advantage of a world teetering on the edge. See a city burning? Loot it. See a palace empty? Move in. See an empire wobble? Give it a push. Or maybe it was all of the above. Imagine a fractured world. Crops failing, cities trembling from tremors beneath the earth, trade routes drying up like riverbeds. And amidst the ruin, hundreds of small groups, farmers, soldiers, fishermen, turning to the only option that guarantees food: movement, force, fire. It wasn't a single invasion. It was a storm system. 100 desperate peoples converging on the same collapsing stage. And the Bronze Age? Well, it was ready to fall. See, the civilizations of that time weren't built for resilience. They were built like spider webs, strong, but only when the threads hold. Each palace economy relied on trade: tin for bronze, grain for labor, wine for prestige. When the networks frayed, due to droughts, invasions, or internal rebellions, the palaces couldn't adapt. They collapsed like lungs with no breath. Take Ugarit, one of the most advanced cities of its time. Writing, art, diplomacy. They were sending messages days before their city vanished. "The enemy is near," one tablet reads. "They have set fire to the land." The message was never sent. When archaeologists found it, it was still in the oven, half-baked. That's how fast the end came. Now here's where things get eerily familiar. You'd think with all that chaos, empires falling, cities burning, we'd have legends, epic poems, songs about the end of the world. But instead, silence. The Greeks don't talk about the Sea Peoples. The Hittites leave no record because, well, they ceased to exist. The only real detailed record comes from Egypt, and even that is drenched in propaganda, as pharaohs were known to exaggerate just a bit. What we're left with is a puzzle with most of the pieces missing and the box long since burned. But there are clues, little ones, buried in ash and buried deeper in context. For example, the change in pottery. Before the collapse, Mycenaean pottery dominates the Eastern Mediterranean. After, new styles emerge, hybrid forms, designs that look Greek but with local twists. Philistine pottery shows up in Canaan, full of Aegean influence, but not purely Mycenaean. It's the fingerprint of migration, of mingling, of strangers setting up camp and changing the local culture just by being there. We also see new fortresses being built, not palaces, fortresses, in places that never needed them before. And writing systems? Vanish. In Greece, Linear B disappears. For 400 years, the Greeks forget how to write. This isn't just collapse, it's amnesia. It's like the lights went out and no one remembered how to turn them back on. They call it the Bronze Age collapse, but that phrase is too clean, too surgical. It wasn't a collapse, it was a slow-motion cataclysm, a domino effect that turned a globalized, interconnected world into a series of small, isolated, illiterate, and scared villages. And through it all, the Sea Peoples were there. Not necessarily as villains, not even as invaders in every case, but as catalysts. Their arrival almost perfectly coincides with the downfall of every major Bronze Age power. And when the smoke cleared, a new world emerged. Smaller kingdoms, iron tools instead of bronze, simpler writing systems, local gods, local cultures. The age of empires was over. The age of heroes was beginning. This was the world that would birth Homer, the world of Odysseus, of small kings and long journeys, a world rebuilding itself from the bones of the old. And the sea peoples? Well, they never return. They vanish from history like a shadow when the torch is relit. Maybe they were absorbed, maybe they died out, maybe they became the very people who would later write the myths and never mention their own name. Or maybe, and this is the strangest theory of all, they never existed. What if the sea peoples weren't one group at all? What if the Egyptians, facing waves of unrelated invaders, just lumped them all under one label? What if sea peoples was shorthand for everyone who showed up uninvited during the worst century in ancient history? It's possible. Because when your world is ending and ships are arriving on the horizon full of strangers with swords, you don't ask for passports. You just call them what they are: sea peoples.
When a civilization dies, it doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just forgets how to write, how to build, how to remember. That's what happened in the wake of the sea peoples. The world they helped unmake didn't vanish in a single apocalyptic fireball. It starved. It withered. It forgot itself. Picture this. You're a child born in a once thriving Bronze Age port. A generation ago, your grandfather traded tin for wine, wrote letters to kings, lit incense in palaces carved with gold-leafed lions. Now, you live in a mud-brick hut. You've never seen bronze. You don't know how to read. And the name of your own city? No one remembers what it meant anymore. That's not just collapse. That's extinction in slow motion. And the sea peoples? They didn't cause the fall entirely, but they sure knew how to kick a civilization when it was down. Let's zoom in on a place that was hit especially hard. Hatti, the seat of the mighty Hittite Empire. These guys were no joke. Chariots, diplomacy, sprawling records of treaties. They even signed the world's oldest known peace treaty with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh, etched in clay in Akkadian, the international language of the day. And then one day, gone. Not conquered, not rebuilt, just silence. No one even found the ruins of their capital, Hattusa, until the early 20th century. When they did, they uncovered burned gates, toppled walls, and tablets left mid-sentence. It's like the Hittites vanished in the middle of a thought. And here's the creepy part. The sea peoples may not have even intended to destroy them. That's how fragile things had become. A few raiding parties, a supply line cut, a refugee group settling in the wrong valley, and the whole Hittite Empire unraveled like a pulled thread. This was a house of cards, and the wind had arrived. But not everyone fell. Egypt, for all its flaws, survived. Barely. Ramses III, yes, the same one who had murals carved showing his victory over the sea peoples, managed to hold the kingdom together like a man tying his house shut with string during a hurricane. But the cost was high. Egypt never fully recovered. The opulent days of Ramses II? Gone. Trade dried up. Tombs got smaller. Temples were looted by their own priests. Bureaucrats started scribbling receipts for missing grain like they were writing horror stories. One papyrus from the time reads like a Bronze Age Yelp complaint. We came to the granary. We found no grain. The soldiers are angry. The people complain. The scribes are afraid. You know, it's bad when even the scribes are scared. And still the question remains, why? Why did it all fall apart at once? Historians call it a systems collapse. That's the academic way of saying everything was so tightly connected that when one part broke, it all fell apart like a bad IKEA shelf. You lose your tin supply? No bronze. No bronze? No weapons. No weapons? Good luck holding back hungry neighbors with torches and zero chill. It wasn't just warfare. It was climate, famine, earthquakes, invasions, mass migrations, all happening within a span of maybe 50 years. It was the world's first truly global crisis.
And in the middle of this swirling storm were the sea peoples. Sometimes they were the storm, sometimes just another leaf caught in the wind, but always there, always moving, always pushing. And here's a thought no one likes to dwell on too long. What if the sea peoples weren't the villains? What if they were just us? Think about it. They weren't described as marauding warlords in every case. Some came with children, with carts, with oxen, with everything they owned. That's not an army. That's an exodus. What if they were fleeing a disaster of their own? A famine, a political collapse, a homeland swallowed by earthquake and fire. What if they were desperate families turned raiders by hunger? One Egyptian text speaks of the invaders like this: "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land stood before their arms. From Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alasia on, all were cut off, removed and scattered." Not exactly bloodthirsty phrasing, more like the language you'd use for uprooted trees. Even Ramses III's great Medinet Habu inscriptions, which show him defeating the Sea Peoples in glorious battle, describe his enemies not as soldiers, but as people. Men, women, children, with ox carts, herds, possessions. This wasn't just conquest. It was migration fueled by desperation. And Egypt? It was the last solid wall left. Imagine being Pharaoh and watching wave after wave of refugees turned raiders crash against your shores, knowing that every victory is just buying time before the next flood. Because here's the secret no one likes to dwell on too long. The empires of the Bronze Age didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they were advanced. They were too big, too dependent on fragile connections, too confident in the stability of a world that had never really been stable. And the Sea Peoples? They were the match that lit the fuel-soaked web. It's tempting to blame the Sea Peoples for the collapse, but blaming the Sea Peoples is like blaming the wind for toppling a house of cards. They didn't build the house. They just walked by at the wrong moment. Still, their presence is undeniable. We find their echoes not in monuments, but in destruction layers. Burned cities, collapsed temples, abandoned ports, pottery shards where languages used to live. They're not the protagonists of this story. Not really. But they're always standing just off stage, watching, waiting, and sometimes walking on.
Sometimes history leaves behind names. Sometimes it only leaves smoke. And when we look for the Sea Peoples, when we really search, not just through charred walls and broken statues, but through what's missing, we find something eerie. The world they helped undo, it didn't just collapse, it went quiet. No kings picking up the pieces, no triumphant new empire rising from the ashes, no unifying voice saying, "Here's how we rebuilt." Just silence. And then fragments. Scattered across the Mediterranean, we find pottery styles that shouldn't be there. In places like Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, cities that will later be called Philistine, archaeologists find Mycenaean-inspired ceramics, strange burial customs, and clues of a new people moving in. Not invaders, not destroyers, settlers. It's like a ghost trail. Sea peoples who stayed. And maybe they weren't called sea peoples at all. Maybe they were just people, hungry, tired, and out of options. They left behind no myths, no Homeric epics, no national legends to whisper their side of the story. All we know is what others said about them, usually in the context of fire and war, which tells you a lot about how history gets written. Not by the hungry, not by the homeless, but by the ones with palaces and scribes and reasons to blame someone for everything falling apart. So let's talk about those fragments. Because if the Sea Peoples didn't leave us a story, maybe the ruins will. On the island of Cyprus, Layers of destruction mark the end of cities like Inkomi and Kition. Once thriving trading hubs turn to rubble. In the layers above, we find signs of new settlers. A different style of house, simpler tools, new pottery. No more tablets, no more palaces. But life, just life. Not a conquered people, a changed one. In Greece, the story is the same. After the fall of Mycenaean cities like Pylos and Tiryns, the records stop. Linear B, the administrative script of the Mycenaean palaces, vanishes. For 400 years, no one in Greece writes anything down. The so-called Greek Dark Age begins. But here's the twist. It's not empty. People still live there. They farm, they herd, they bury their dead. The elite culture is gone, the kings, the scribes, the imported goods, but the people adapt. They become smaller, local, grounded, and slowly, over centuries, they begin to reimagine the world. Oral stories rise to fill the void. Gods become closer, heroes become larger, and out of that silence, a new voice begins to form, one that will eventually shape Homer, Athens, and the world. So what if the collapse wasn't just destruction? What if it was transformation? What if the sea peoples were the midwives of a new world? It's not a romantic idea, not for the people whose homes burned, not for the cities that died screaming. But history doesn't care about comfort. It cares about change. And the change was everywhere. Take the tools. Bronze, once the lifeblood of elite warfare and craftsmanship, disappears in places. But iron, rare and crude at first, begins to take its place. The Iron Age is born not because it was better, but because it was available. Trade networks that once spanned continents shrank into regional circuits. Small ports replaced great empires, and local leaders, clan chiefs, petty kings emerged where god kings once ruled. In the Levant, new cities rose with names like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Small, but nimble, survivors of the storm. In Kyonin, a new group, calling themselves Israelites, began to carve out territory in the highlands, leaving behind humble pottery and simple altars. In Greece, people started burying their dead with a new type of pottery, geometric, abstract, minimalist, the kind of art you make when the old gods have gone quiet and you're trying to find order in the ashes. Even Egypt, bruised but breathing, changed. After Ramesses III, the pharaohs shrank in power. Tombs became smaller. Nobles stole from royal graves, and the priests of Ammon began acting more like kings than spiritual guides. A slow fragmentation, a hollowing out, a long, dusty slide into memory. And through it all, the sea peoples faded into the very cultures they had shaken. It's one of the strangest things about them. They were everywhere, and then they were part of everywhere. Maybe the Peliset became the Philistines, building walled cities along the coast. Maybe the Denyen helped shape Greek myths, showing up later as Danai or Achaeans in stories passed down over wine-dark seas. Maybe the Shekelish gave their name to Sicily, or maybe they just became farmers on someone else's land. There is no grand monument to them, no carved tablets detailing their rise and fall, only ruin, rebuilding, and reinvention. And maybe that's the lesson here. Because while kings wrote their names in stone, while empires measured time in gold and grain and tribute, the sea peoples did something else. They moved, they adapted, and then they disappeared. Not as ghosts, but as ancestors, folded into the cultures that would one day call themselves Greek, Hebrew, Phoenician. Not enemies, not heroes, just people, like anyone else trying to survive when the sky falls down. So the next time someone tells you history is made by the victors, remember this: sometimes
It's made by the survivors, the ones who didn't leave behind palaces or poems, just footprints in the sand.
By now, we've walked the ash-choked halls of forgotten cities. We've watched the sea peoples land with their strange ships and stranger names. We've seen empires buckle under their weight, or under the weight of the world crumbling behind them. And yet, for all this destruction, for all the chariots broken and palaces burned, the world didn't end. It reinvented itself. The Bronze Age was over, but something else had begun to stir in the ruins. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The hum of hammers striking iron, the scratch of new alphabets being etched into clay and inked onto parchment, the slow, stubborn heartbeat of survival. This is the part of the story we often overlook, because collapse stories are sexy, apocalyptic, dramatic, but survival? Reinvention? That's messier, slower, quieter. It doesn't always leave a heroic statue. It leaves seeds. And those seeds, they grew. Let's start with language. When the great palatial civilizations fell, they took their scripts with them. Linear B, gone. Cuneiform, still used for a bit, then faded. Egyptian hieroglyphs, simplified, fragmented. But in the ruins of Ugarit, something new had already begun, an alphabet. Not a syllabary, not a logogram, but a true alphabet, 20-something characters, each standing for a sound. Easy to learn, portable, democratic. It was invented just before the collapse, and after the fires, it spread. Phoenician traders carried it across the Mediterranean. The Greeks adapted it. Then the Romans. Then us. So if you're reading these words now, thank a scribal culture that collapsed and gave way to something leaner, faster, freer. From ash, phonetics. From ruin, literacy. And then there's iron. The Iron Age didn't burst into being overnight. It crept. At first, iron was crude, brittle, uneven, inferior to bronze. But bronze needed tin, and tin was far away, traded, scarce, vulnerable. Iron was local, everywhere. And in a post-collapse world where long-distance trade had become suicide, iron won. The Sea Peoples didn't invent ironworking, but they helped make its rise inevitable. Because when you burn the networks to the ground, people start using what's right in front of them. You lose temples, you find shrines. You lose kings, you find chieftains. You lose certainty, you find adaptation. Which brings us to one final place, a place where the Sea Peoples may have left their strangest legacy of all, the Bible. Now wait, before you roll your eyes, understand that the Old Testament is in part a memory of this exact moment in time. Not a perfect record, not a neutral one, but an echo. The book of Judges, for instance, is set during the chaotic centuries after the Bronze Age collapse. The Philistines, often named enemies, are likely the Peleset, one of the Sea Peoples. They show up in places the Egyptians said they settled. They build cities, fight battles, clash with the Israelites. And if you strip away the theology and just look at the bones of the story, it's the same story we've been telling all along. Cities fall, nomads rise, borders shift. New gods are born in the gaps between the old. Even the famous David and Goliath story. It's a tale of a small emergent power going up against the last embers of an older, foreign warrior caste. Goliath wears bronze, David uses a stone. Symbolic? Absolutely. A metaphor for the end of the Bronze Age? Maybe. It doesn't mean the Bible is a historical document in the modern sense, but it does mean that the memory of the Sea Peoples
and the chaos they ushered in lived on, filtered through myth, retold in campfires and temple scrolls, twisted, blurred, repainted. That's the real tragedy of the Sea Peoples. Not that they destroyed civilizations, but that they never got to tell their side of the story. We know them only through the eyes of their victims, were their enemies, or the victors who carved battle scenes into stone walls and said, "Look, we beat them. We survived. We were right." But history is rarely so simple. Maybe the Sea Peoples were invaders. Maybe they were refugees. Maybe they were a symptom, not a cause. Or maybe they were all of those things at once. After all, history doesn't happen in clean lines. It happens in the blur. And maybe that's why we're still so obsessed with them. Because they don't fit. Not in the old stories, not in the neat boxes, not in the categories historians love. They're a riddle, a question, a reminder that civilizations aren't eternal, that trade routes don't last forever, that writing can vanish, that power, once fractured, doesn't always come back, and that sometimes the tide doesn't just recede. It takes you with it. Which leads us here, to now. Because whether you're watching this at midnight with the fan humming in the background, or during your lunch break with coffee in hand, the Sea Peoples matter. Not just as a historical mystery, but as a warning. Complex systems break. Global networks fail. And when they do, it's not always the obvious enemies that bring them down. Sometimes it's the ones no one saw coming. The ones with no empire, no name, just hunger and sails and momentum.
So, what are we left with? A whisper of sails on the horizon, a burned city, a name carved in someone else's stone, and a silence so loud it echoes across 3,000 years. The Sea Peoples didn't leave us stories, but they became one. A story not about who they were exactly, but what happens when the world breaks and nobody knows how to fix it. Because that's what the Bronze Age collapse really was. Not a war, not a single invasion, but a breakdown of trade, of language, of trust, of systems so interconnected that when one thread snapped, the whole thing unraveled. And in the void, they came. Call them what you want. Pirates, refugees, migrants, invaders. They sailed in with everything they owned and nothing to lose. And they didn't ask permission, because by then, there was no one left to grant it. It's easy to paint them as villains, the destroyers of the old world, the raiders who burned Troy, sacked Ugarit, and nearly broke Egypt itself. But the truth is more uncomfortable. They may have been victims too, born into a dying world, trained by cultures that no longer fed them, shaped by collapse, forced to move, to fight, to survive. Not out of conquest, but out of necessity. They were the future crashing into a past that refused to make space for them. And when the dust settled, they were gone. No empire, no legacy, just fragments. And us, on the other end of the story, still trying to read between the ashes, still trying to understand how a thriving, interconnected world could come undone so quickly. Still asking, could it happen again? We live in a world not unlike theirs, if we're being honest. Complex, global, intertwined. Our food comes from far away. Our phones depend on minerals from halfway across the globe. Our economies run on ships and contracts and trust. And our systems? Efficient, optimized, streamlined, but also fragile, Because complexity is a double-edged sword. It gives us wonders, but it also gives us vulnerabilities. A blocked canal can stall global trade. A drought in one region can cause famine in another. A war in a country you couldn't find on a map can send shockwaves through your grocery bill. We like to believe we're different, that our satellites and smartphones make us immune to collapse. But the sea peoples would probably laugh at that, because their world had everything: art, diplomacy, international treaties, commerce, even intergovernmental mail. They thought they'd figured it out too, until they hadn't. So maybe the story of the sea peoples isn't a mystery to solve. Maybe it's a cautionary tale, not about barbarians at the gates, but about what happens when the center no longer holds. About what happens when people are pushed too far for too long, when the land dries up, when the harvest fails, when the kings argue while the ships arrive, and when it becomes clear that no one is coming to save you. That's the world the sea peoples sailed into, or fled from, or helped ignite. And when it was over, nothing was the same. From their chaos came something new: the alphabet, iron tools, local cultures rising from imperial dust, the roots of nations we still know today. Even Homer, writing centuries later, may have been echoing their legacy. When he described longboats on foreign shores, heroes in exile, cities in flames, maybe he wasn't just telling a story. Maybe he was remembering. And maybe that's the only justice the sea peoples ever got: to live on in myth, if not in memory. So the next time you hear someone say history is progress, that things always get better, that collapse is a thing of the past, remember them. The ones with no script, no monument, no voice, only sails and fire and change. You can still see them sometimes, in the ruins, in the pottery, in the DNA of people who never knew they were part of a ghost story. And maybe, just maybe, in the tides of our own time. After all, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does remember. It remembers in cycles. It remembers in silences. And it remembers in people, just like the sea peoples.